a lawyer at 27, and was just 32 when President Harding appointed her Assistant Attorney General in 1921. She became the enemy of the bootleggers and of what would become organized crime.
For all of my life, I've had the most uncanny feeling that always seems to say to me, you are marked to step into a crisis sometime as the instrument of God. It seems that it may mean danger or disgrace or in some way cause me agony of heart, but I can't escape it. With recurring frequency, I've had the feeling so often all my life, since I was a very little girl. Lately, I've quit fighting it.
Apparently, trying to enforce prohibition was that special mission that God had in mind for her. That gave her the strength she needed to persist, but it also gave her a kind of fanatical edge.
Willebrandt believed in upholding the law of prohibition. She had wine, certainly before, or whiskey sours before she came into office. She didn't drink at all while she was in office, and she worked fiercely and was viewed as a zealot to enforce the law.
It's often said that drinking actually went up during Prohibition, but that wasn't the case. The only thing that went up was the price. Name brand whiskey, for instance, went from $0.10 a shot to as much as $3. People may have just thought there was more drinking because it was more daring, more celebrated, more extreme. One drink's recipe from the time captured the atmosphere.
Take 3 chorus girls and 3 men. Soak in champagne till midnight. Squeeze into an automobile. Add a drunken chauffeur and a dash of joy. Shake well. Serve at 70 miles an hour. Chaser, a coroner's inquest.
The saloon had been replaced by speakeasies, some of which lived up to their Hollywood image of secret peepholes, breathless passwords, and fantastic decor. Many of the best-known people in society visited the speakeasies.
So you have millions of lawbreakers, perfectly law-abiding citizens otherwise, who now are breaking a federal law by drinking. And so the line becomes blurred, and organized crime is much more intertwined in American life because of Prohibition in a way that it had not before then.
She kept saying that the upper class, the Kennedys of this world, had a particular responsibility. She felt that was very important, and she pressed that and said there seemed to be sometimes just then the working class that was out there made prey of the bootleggers.
But she found herself with few true allies in the Justice Department.
She was surrounded by older, skeptical men who were doubtful about the whole enterprise. She got very little cooperation from the attorneys general. Harry Daugherty, for example, Harding's notoriously crooked attorney general, gave her no cooperation.
The Justice Department made a great song and dance about clamping down on bootleggers, calling in the newsreel cameramen to show their dramatic raids to the public.
When I was appointed to this office, I stated publicly and promised myself that we would enforce the national prohibition policies honestly and earnestly and lawfully. I do not like spectacular methods or anything that may be described as a drive. Steady, relentless pressure, intelligently applied to the maximum of our resources at all times and in all seasons is our aim and intention.
The truth was that the feds frequently turned a blind eye. The Prohibition Bureau agents were poorly paid and easily bribed. 1 in 12 was dismissed for corruption, and many quit to become bootleggers. But Willebrandt refused to give up. She began a campaign in Florida, where much of the booze was coming in via the Bahamas and Cuba. Willebrandt was determined to clamp down.
The most dramatic was in Florida, where she really got all of the government agencies, the Navy, which sent down 11 destroyers, the Coast Guard, you had 30 vessels, 2 airplanes. And in a gigantic attack, you really had them make tremendous raids.
It was something of a personal triumph for Willebrandt, but when she turned her attention to padlocking New York's speakeasies, she stirred up criticism.
People did call foul because they thought it was a little unfortunate that you were having all of these raids, and the raids were highly publicized because there were so many of them, plus which the U.S. attorney obviously was not agreeing with Mabel and was giving out adverse stories that there was a sort of Roman holiday going on there. But great was Flapdoodle. She just blew it off and said, this is something we've been doing, and in her annual report that year, she pointed out that 7,000 padlocks injunctions had been actually instituted that year, and she was pleased because after the headlines went, they'd taken 18 to court and they'd found guilty 15 of them.
But Willebrandt was getting worn down by the constant struggle.
Mabel's great frustration was you always got the little fish. It was very hard to get the big fish, and she wanted the big fish. She had a cartoon that she kept which showed her with a mop trying to mop it up and keep it back, the incoming waves, and it was obvious that there was this inundation coming. When she left office in 1929, she wrote to her parents that she felt very often like the little boy who put his arm in the dike, and so she stopped a lot of things, she said, but it's a wearing way to be a hero.
Years later, a judge said of Willebrandt, if Mabel had worn trousers, she would have been president. But despite her good work, some of the worst criminals in American history were beginning to emerge. The most important legacy of Prohibition was the creation of organized crime. But it wasn't the Irish gang nor the Jewish mob that would ultimately rule. It was the Cosa Nostra, better known as the Italian Mafia.
The Italians had the Mafia. No one else had that secret criminal brotherhood, and that gives the Italians an extraordinary cohesiveness and a kind of national organization that the Irish and Jewish gangs did not have.
From the quiet, dark alleys of Little Italy to the flamboyance of Al Capone, the Italian criminals have survived and flourished like no others. But to understand their dominance in the underworld, one must go back. After World War I, powerful Irish gangs controlled the lucrative Brooklyn waterfront, collecting tribute, about $1,500 a week, from each of the more than 60 dock owners. Those who declined saw their wharves and vessels looted, burned, or wrecked, or worse.
The East Coast Longshoremen has been a mobbed-up union for most of this century. It started even before Prohibition, originally with Irish guys on the Brooklyn docks. It was a very dangerous occupation to be head of the Longshoremen's Union on the Brooklyn docks because you had a short life expectancy. 6 or 8 guys in a single decade would take this job, be killed off, someone else would get the job, be killed off.
The Brooklyn Bridge area was traditionally Irish territory.
The White Hand Gang, or shall we say the Irish Mafia, they were an underworld superpower. They had control, literal control over 60 piers in operation in Brooklyn at the time. It was a gold mine.
But the White Hand would soon meet their match. The Italian gangs, known as the Black Hand, wanted the riches for themselves. From 1920 to 1925, a grim war raged along the waterfront for control of the lush extortion rackets. For a time, the leader of the White Hand, Wild Bill Lovett, held off the Italian Black Hand.
While Bill Lovett was the most spectacular gang leader the White Hand ever had. On the waterfront, everybody knew that this man will, as soon as look at you, blow your head off. The man was a very dangerous man, really.
No less fearless was the Italian leader of the Black Hand, Frankie Yale. He retained an iron-fisted control over his men.
Frankie Yale was the first celebrity godfather. No question about it.
Yale was the first of the openly flamboyant gangsters. He was known as the Prince of Pals. He was an extremely popular person, not least for the fact that he liked to cultivate a sort of Robin Hood image of taking from the rich and giving to the poor.
For instance, during the coal strike of 1922, Yale's men delivered coal to hundreds of families who were freezing. This was the paradox about Frankie Yale. He was vicious, and yet he was also sympathetic.
The reason for Frankie Yale's generosity, in my personal opinion, was he was born into abject poverty. He knew what it was to be poor. And he had, his heart went out for the poor people.
But still, the bloody feud went on, and Yale needed tough henchmen.
He was introduced to Alphonse Capone at a very young age, and he took a liking to Al. He tutored Al in the ABCs of the underworld.
Yale put Capone to work as a bartender and a bouncer in his dance club. From his humble beginnings in Brooklyn, Al Capone would carry a nickname for the rest of his life: Scarface. One night while Capone was working, he told a female customer, "You got a beautiful ass." Her brother, Frank Galluccio, took out his knife, aimed for Capone's throat, but instead slashed his face 3 times. Gangsters lived dangerously, and before long, Capone savagely beat up a member of the White Hand Gang. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, came looking for him.
Frankie Yale got word that Wild Bill Lovett was trying to track down Capone. He says, "Al, look, the best thing I could tell you, this man is gonna, sooner or later, with the scars and all for identification, he's gonna get you, sooner or later."
So Frankie Yale sent Al Capone to work with Johnny Torrio in Chicago. It proved a lucky move. When Prohibition began, Frankie Yale mobilized his Black Hand troops into bootlegging, using his links in Chicago.
What Prohibition did was it took rather loosely organized neighborhood gangs and it put them into transnational communication with each other. Because what was involved was the shipping of various liquors from one part of the country to another, even from outside the country, it was of enormous benefit towards making this a sort of national combination.
The White Hand's power was waning. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, was gruesomely murdered by the Black Hand. When Richard Peg-Leg Lonergan took over, Al Capone returned to Brooklyn to get rid of this Irish gang once and for all.
Sylvester Agulia was the man chosen to start the ball in motion. He was to whack a top lieutenant of the Irish White Hand gang across the head with a meat cleaver. That was the signal. The lights went out and the gunfire erupted immediately. The outcome was the murder, a triple gangland murder, as a matter of fact. Al Capone had finally murdered a man, Richard Lonergan. It turned out to be the most important murder of his whole career. His reputation throughout the Italian underworld nationally really zoomed, because what he actually did was hand over the entire Brooklyn waterfront to the Italian underworld. And after, very soon after, the White Hand gang evaporated into nothing at all, just died out.
Now Frankie Yale controlled the New York waterfront and was Al Capone's chief liquor supplier. Capone quickly became Chicago's crime boss. It was the beginning of the rise of the Italian Mafia. The Prohibition era created many underworld criminals, but ultimately, the Italians would reign supreme. In the years to come, the Italian Mafia would take aim at many other targets, but in turn, they would become the crime fighters' main target